Welcome to the Engineering with Nature podcast. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has been working on the Engineering with Nature initiative since 2010, working and collaborating to advance the use of natural processes and systems to deliver a broad range of economic, environmental, and social benefits. EWN develops and implements nature-based solutions for water and infrastructure projects. It brings together a growing international community of practitioners, scientists, engineers, and researchers to harness the power of nature to innovate and solve problems and create sustainable solutions. This podcast tells their stories. Now here's your host, Sarah Thorne of Decision Partners.
This is the first of a two-part podcast focused on the World Bank's approach to using natural infrastructure solutions to address some of the most pressing climate change challenges in the world. And we're talking about the synergies with Engineering with Nature's approach, including the application of natural and nature-based solutions. Our guests are Todd Bridges, National Lead of the Engineering with Nature program at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and Brenden Jongman, Senior Disaster Management Specialist at the World Bank. Todd, maybe you'd like to welcome Brenden and tell us a bit about how you two got together.
Yes, thank you, Sarah, and welcome, Brenden. It is a bit of a crazy story that illustrates how small the world really is when a guy like me from the San Joaquin Valley of California meets a guy from the Netherlands over the topic of nature-based solutions. But it traces back to an effort the World Bank undertook in 2017 to develop guidance for itself on the use of nature-based solutions. That's when Brenden and I first met, and we've had a series of ongoing conversations and, in fact, collaborations since then.
Brenden, I understand you went from working on flood risk management in the Netherlands to now working in Africa. And I understand you're leading a really interesting initiative using nature-based solutions to reduce urban flood risks. We're certainly going to talk more about that. But before we do, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your role at the World Bank.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks for having me on the show. Indeed, I'm not from the US. Your audience may hear from my accent. I'm from that small country that is the Netherlands. And if there's one thing that you may want to know about the Netherlands is that most of the country is actually situated below sea level. So we have an extensive system of levees and dikes to keep the water out. And used to go running on those dikes, looking at the water on the one hand side being actually higher than the land on the other side. So since we all have to do our part, I also started working in this field. I did a PhD and a bunch of research focused on flooding and adaptation to climate change. And even in that time, the awareness in the Netherlands started rising that building dikes alone is really not going to cut it. And that we'll need to give more space to the water, create solutions in harmony with nature, using things like engineering with nature principles. So yeah, these days I'm working with the World Bank, which is headquartered in Washington, D.C. And in my time working at the World Bank, this approach of working with nature has become a very central theme to my work. We still have a lot to learn. There's also a lot of progress, and we have a lot to learn from people like Todd here.
To put things into perspective a little bit, let's talk about the scale and the scope of global infrastructure and the kind of natural hazards that you're both working on. And Todd, maybe you could talk about some of the critical challenges we're facing in the world and put that into context for us.
The challenge is very significant and getting larger. For example, in 2020, natural disasters like storms and floods and droughts and wildfires created more than $200 billion in damage worldwide and was responsible for the deaths of 8,000 people. You could look at the North Atlantic hurricane season. It was a record-setting season with 30 named storms, 12 of which hit landfall. And of the 10 costliest natural disasters in 2020, 6 out of 10 occurred in the United States. The U.S.'s portion of that $200+ billion 2020 year $95 billion of the costs were in the United States. And one other statistic, if we look at just the weather and climate related disasters in the United States, since the year 1980, there have been 285 weather and climate related disasters that have produced at least $1 billion in damage. 285 since 1980. And if you sum the total damages across all of those events, the cost is more than $1.8 trillion. And in addition to that, more than 14,000 people in the United States died as a consequence of those 285 events. So the scope of the problem is enormous. And we've got to find solutions, innovative solutions for this going forward in the 21st century.
And Brenden, that's a lot of your role in disaster risk management at the World Bank. You're looking at these kinds of challenges on an international level. Can you talk a bit about what your work is focused on?
The challenge that Todd describes is definitely what we see at the global scale as well. And we see disasters getting more frequent, more intense, and hitting especially the most vulnerable hardest. Now, the World Bank is an international financing organization that has the overall objective of ending extreme poverty and building shared prosperity across the countries that we work in. And we do so by supporting countries with knowledge, with advice, and also with financing. And some people, when they hear about the World Bank, they think that our buildings are full of just economists and bankers. But actually, we work across basically all areas, from education to healthcare, public policy, environment, and indeed to disaster risk management and climate change. So you may ask, why does an organization like the World Bank that aims to fight poverty focus on climate change and the use of natural infrastructure? That's because there's a very strong link actually between disasters and poverty that might not be obvious at the start. We see that the poor and the vulnerable are often most exposed to and most vulnerable to the impact of disasters. So more often than not, the poor communities live in areas prone to disasters, in buildings that are less able to resist. And when those disasters do happen, be it a flood that destroys houses or a drought that wipes out crops, those poor people usually have limited financial buffer to recover from those events. And often a single disaster event actually can push a family below the poverty line. So research by some of my colleagues at the World Bank shows that climate change is expected to push an additional 100 million people globally into poverty in the coming years if we don't act for this reason.
So many of these solutions to the multiple challenges and hazards that we face come back to infrastructure. Todd, maybe you can talk a little bit about what we're talking about when we talk about infrastructure in this context and why it's so critical that we address it now. Think about infrastructure now.
Well, when you consider the scope of the challenges related to natural hazards, which we've been discussing, or you think about the needs of a growing humanity, by the end of this century, the human population is expected to be above 10 billion people. And those people need services from infrastructure. So there's going to be significant investment in infrastructure worldwide. And we've mentioned before on our podcast that organizations like the World Economic Forum have estimated that just by mid-century, $100 trillion will be invested in infrastructure worldwide. So what will that infrastructure look like? What is it? I mean, we're accustomed to thinking of infrastructure as built, things made out of concrete and rock, but it's got to be more than that. I think as we seek innovative solutions to the challenges and to the needs that people have. There was a paper actually published just this past December, and we reached a milestone on planet Earth. In the year 2020, the amount of human-produced mass in the form of materials, infrastructure materials like concrete and aggregate, like stone, rock, brick, and asphalt, the amount of human-produced mass in the form of these materials now exceeds the total mass of all living things on the planet.
That's astonishing.
And, at more than 1 teraton. That's a one with 12 zeros behind it. And in fact, every 20 years during the 20th century, the amount of human produced mass in the form of these materials, it doubled every 20 years. And this what's been going on really kind of challenges notions of sustainability. So my point is that we need to figure out how nature itself can be a part of the solution as we develop infrastructure in the future.
Just to emphasize also on Todd's point on the need for infrastructure and the way that nature-based solutions come in there, we see that on a day-to-day basis. So as an example, one of the countries I've been based in is Madagascar, which is a large island nation off the coast of Africa. And it has the capital city of Antananarivo, which is a beautiful name. It usually goes by the shorter version of Tana. And it's basically the only major city in the country. Many people in search of employment, education, healthcare, a better future for their kids, they move there from the countryside, causing the city to grow by about 100,000 people every year. And the problem is there that the city is built originally on 7 hills, but those 7 hills are already fully built. The rest of the city is expanding in the midst of a floodplain with a series of wetlands that used to store water, and a large part of that floodplain used to flood quite often. So for the urban development there, the government really needs to put in place a strong urban plan, put an enormous amount of infrastructure, roads, drainage, flood protection, but also critical facilities like healthcare, schools. And all the while, we need to see how we prevent those people and the infrastructure from being wiped out by large floods all the time. So in these cases, we need to be ready to see, well, how do we work with that natural environment? How do we protect the ecosystems that are already there? How do we plan that infrastructure and the things that people need while maintaining the natural environment and reducing the flooding and the risk to people?
You and Todd both talked about the increase in urbanization. What's the link between climate change and urbanization?
So the link is quite complex, I would say. So on the one hand, the main problem with urbanization, rapid urbanization, is that this rapid urbanization is often unplanned. So people move to the city, they go live in areas that are not well developed, and often those areas are located in areas prone to disasters. With climate change, we see that flooding is becoming more extreme. It's becoming more frequent. And often those unplanned areas where people rapidly move to are those areas that are mostly affected by flooding. And therefore, the impact on those people becomes more frequent. We also see an increasing problem of heat waves due to global temperature increase. Many cities around the world, be it in the United States or in Africa or anywhere else in the world, are experiencing these episodes of heat waves on a more frequent basis. And having cities that are growing rapidly, people living densely in neighborhoods that are not well developed, causes these heat waves also to cause many fatalities.
Adding on a bit to what Brenden was noting about the trends worldwide, more than half of the world's population now, so more than 4 billion people, live in urban environments in cities. And 1 in 3 of those people around the world live in impoverished conditions where they lack access to things like clean water and other services. And these populations are extremely vulnerable to the hazards we've been discussing. And by 2050, it's estimated that 2/3 of the human population will live in cities and urban environments. So we have this move toward the urban that Brenden mentioned. And while that happens, it's also a move away from nature. And the issue that this creates in part is that people need access to nature. It's actually quite fundamental to who we are, and it also supports our physical and mental health. The landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted in the 19th century, it's one of my favorite quotes. He said, "It is a scientific fact that the occasional contemplation of natural scenes is favorable to the health and vigor of men. And there's a whole burgeoning science in this field now that shows the connection between human exposure and experience in nature to our very health. And so that's another dynamic beyond, producing infrastructure systems that perform and provide engineering function and protect people from natural hazards, but also support their well-being in these growing urban settings.
And a real challenge to have people that live in urban settings understand and value and protect nature if they don't have the exposure to it. So the urgency to really think about nature-based solutions is now. And I think it's something that you've been focusing on a lot, Brenden, and I know the World Bank has been focusing on that. Can you talk a little bit about the work that you're doing and your nature-based solutions guidance?
I think this is exactly the point that we are trying to bring in some of the guidance notes that we've developed together, and also some of the projects that we are implementing. That the main message that we have is that we need to move to the more systematic and robust identification and implementation of solutions that consider both the hard engineering, both the infrastructure that we need, and the nature-based solutions. And in many cases, these nature-based solutions come with huge benefits that gray infrastructure traditionally does not have. So a coastal park, for example, instead of a flood wall, may protect the community from dangerous waves and storm surge during a hurricane, while also creating opportunities for local recreation, create jobs. The trees can absorb carbon, which may help to reach the national or the global climate change targets. Planting trees and green roofs within a city may bring down the temperature of that city, while also helping to manage flooding. And another example is coastal mangroves, which we're doing a lot of work on, and Todd is also doing a lot of work on, which can provide flood protection while also supporting local fish stocks, important for the population, for example. But we shouldn't be, we shouldn't lie that nature-based solutions will be able to address every problem that we have. You often need a combination of gray and green, and you need to have your drainage infrastructure. You need to have your coastal protection. My own country, we would be well underwater if we only relied on nature, of course, if we want to live in the place that we are living. So by implementing both green and gray solutions, both the effectiveness of the interventions can often go up, the benefits can increase, and sometimes the costs come down. And that's really where we're trying to go, to make sure from the start we look at it in an integrative way, try to bring nature in those cities, in those as part of the solution to those problems, but always keeping our eye also on the actual risks that need to be addressed.
Well, I wanted to build on a very good point that Brenden made previously about the need for multiple solutions and to integrate these solutions, the conventional engineering with nature-based engineering, because the challenges that we're experiencing are very complex, and it really calls for a diversified set of solutions where we can draw different kinds of solutions together and to combine them. And I would reference my experience in what I'm calling California's August apocalypse in 2020. I happened to be in California at the time when they were experiencing a heat wave that was severe enough that it taxed the power grid in California, resulting in rolling blackouts across the state. At that same period, they experienced a dry lightning storm that produced more than 12,000 lightning strikes that resulted in more than 500 wildfires that burned 2.5 million acres and so severely degraded air quality across the state to unhealthy, even hazardous levels that the recommendation was stay indoors. And the wildfire season last year was a record in the state. It burned more than 4 million acres, producing $12 billion in damage. And all during the COVID pandemic. That's the kind of complex of hazards that we have undergoing now, that we have to have challenges and be able to meet the challenges for.
How are you addressing that sort of thing, Brenden, in your work? The multi-hazard, multi-challenge that you're facing on all the projects that you're working on, really?
Yeah, so I think this is a huge challenge, and I actually think that natural infrastructure often has an edge over more gray infrastructure approaches when it comes to addressing multiple hazards. We have many areas in the world that are facing both floods and droughts. When you look at building gray infrastructure solutions for drainage or water storage, for example, they might be very well suited to draining the water very rapidly in times of a flood. But it also means that in times of a drought, the soil is often much drier and it's well drained, and the agriculture that might be in that area might be suffering from that water shortage. So when we develop more integrated river basin solutions, for example, that use reforestation over river basin together with the drainage interventions, you can create a situation where the forest both captures the water in times of flood and reduces downstream flooding. While at the same time you create a more natural environment where there's more water available in the soils in times of a drought. So often some of these nature-based solutions can be more dynamic, and we're doing that for flood and drought. Another example is looking at landslides, for example. Some work we're trying to do is looking at some of the roads that governments are building that are prone to landslides from the hillsides. And there also you can create some kind of concrete blocks to keep the soil from sliding. But by developing these nature-based solutions, for example, doing reforestation on unstable landslides, you can both reduce that risk of earth sliding while also reducing the risk of floods in that very same area.
Brenden, maybe you can talk about the work that you're leading in Mozambique, because I understand you're facing some very, very tough urban challenges. Maybe you could talk about how you're applying nature-based solutions to address some of the issues that you're facing there.
Yeah, sure. So Mozambique, the city of Beira specifically, which is somewhere halfway north of the country in Mozambique, which is located in southeastern Africa. It's a rapidly developing place. So this is also one of these cities that's rapidly growing. It's on the coast. It's facing storms already. It's facing flooding often. And what happened in 2019 was actually that one of the biggest cyclones, the worst cyclone that ever hit the African continent, made landfall in that city of Beira. It caused 1,000 deaths in Mozambique, Malawi, and Zimbabwe, which are the neighboring countries. And it cost about $3 billion in damage. Now, we are having various initiatives where we are working with the government of Mozambique to really strengthen the resilience of that city. And one of the projects that we actually implemented before this hurricane came to land was the development of one of the largest urban parks on the African continent. It's designed as a real nature-based solution, which means that it's a park that has both recreation areas, it has a museum, it has restaurants and areas for people to cycle, for example. And at the same time, it's designed also in a way that it stores the flood water, and in time of heavy rain, it makes sure that the parts of the city don't flood. Now, right now, the World Bank, after the big cyclone that hit the country 2 years ago, made further funding available to also look at the coastal protection of the city, using some of those lessons and really looking at the coastal protection system, seeing how can we not only make sure that the next cyclone doesn't cause flooding in this city, but how can we use some of the lessons that we learned in the development of this park and also potentially creating further nature-based solutions that can have benefit for the local population while also increasing the resilience.
Brenden, did you mention, I don't remember if you mentioned in the last bit, you said that you all are making annually a $1 billion investment in nature-based solutions?
Yeah, so when we look at the World Bank's portfolio, as we say, so the investments that we're making on an annual basis, that's in the amount of several billions, several tens of billions across the different sectors that we are working on. Now, specifically on nature-based solutions, on the use of green infrastructure for the purpose of resilience, and this can be for coastal protection, as we mentioned, also for water purification purposes, where we use wetlands, for example, for water cleaning. The total amount of those investments comes to about $1 billion per year globally that the World Bank is doing. And we see a rapid increase, actually. Since 2018, we recorded about a 20% increase in the amount of financing that the World Bank is making in nature-based solutions. And this really shows not just the push from the World Bank, not the importance of the topic and the World Bank alone, but it really shows the demand from countries for these kind of solutions. Because we provide the financing, we do the projects with the countries, for the countries on their request and with their leadership. So seeing really the uptake in those kind of solutions within our portfolio of investments is really encouraging.
Oh yeah, I mean that's fantastic.
Coping with environmental and climate crises in a normal year is one thing, but this has been an unprecedented year. Is there an opportunity for nature-based solutions to support post-pandemic recovery efforts? We'll discuss this further with Todd Bridges and Brenden Jongman in the second part of this podcast. We hope you'll join us.
You've been listening to the EWN podcast with Sarah Thorne. We encourage you to join the conversation. Visit our website at engineeringwithnature.org. This podcast was developed by Sarah Thorne and Jeff King, Deputy National Lead, Engineering with Nature Initiative, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The Engineering with Nature podcast is produced by Eye Contact Productions. I'm Dave Trafford.